Hello.
Hello.
Look at you.
Okay.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect.
Technical problem here.
Oh,
Oh, there we go. Okay. Can you guys hear me okay?
absolutely.
Okay,
Turn your
perfect.
webcam on.
My webcam is on?
No,
you
not
have to turn
yet.
it on.
It should be on. Is that better?
No, but if you look at the bottom
Uh-oh.
of the Zoom meeting,
My
There's a-
webcam's not on.
yeah, and it should say start video.
Can you, oh, there. Okay, it should be working now, but now I'm frozen again. I can hear you. Okay, I think somebody's moving now. Okay. We've had so many meetings today on Teams, and every time it freezes, I panic. So I'm glad that you guys can hear me all right.
Fair enough. Okay, it looks like we have a good amount of our attendees signed in now, and we're set up. So Kim, you're able to start when you want.
Absolutely. So my name's Kimberly Coates, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar focusing on communicating through a pandemic. As everybody is well aware, we're dealing with a global health crisis, and so certain aspects of our business have become much more complicated. Communicating with our tenants is more important than ever to be sure that not only can owners and managers of rental housing implement best practices to properly navigate their businesses through COVID-19, we also want to be sure that we're supporting tenants throughout this as well, because it's been a very stressful and difficult time for everybody across the board. I'll start by just thanking our sponsor. So this webinar is brought to us today, sponsored by TELUS. The TELUS Partner Program is designed to give residents access to enhanced offers, savings, and customer service. Building value for your company by pursuing the interest of residents via a partnership agreement with TELUS. The aim of the program is to build a long-term partnership between TELUS and your company, ensuring residents in your building portfolio are informed of the latest offers and benefits for most competitive rates. Your dedicated TELUS channel manager will act as an advocate on behalf of your company. Their role is to ensure residents have access to our latest technologies, best-in-class services, as TELUS works towards building out the pure fiber network. TELUS greatly looks forward to working with you and deliver future-friendly solutions for residential services. Our panelists today, so again, my name is Kimberly Coates. I'm the Director of Member Engagement with LandlordBC, and I'll be moderating the conversation. My colleague, Hunter Boucher from LandlordBC, he's our Director of Operations and our legislative expert. We also are very fortunate to have with us the VP of Operations for BC and Alberta from Hollyburn Properties, Allan Wasel. And then as well, we have the Managing Broker from Pemberton Homes, Claire Flewelling-Wyatt. Both of them have excellent experience in the rental housing industry. I'm sure many people are familiar with Hollyburn Properties with their multi-unit residential housing. And then Claire, as the managing broker of Pemberton Homes, their portfolio for property management is varied. They have some multi-unit residential, they do condo, they also have some single family homes. So there's lots of good information that she's able to share with us in order how to manage different types of properties. Perfect. All right. So if you guys would like to do a little bit of an introduction, Hunter, did you want to start us off?
I think we're actually starting with Claire.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, hi, good afternoon, everyone. As Kimberly mentioned, my name is Claire Flewelling-Wyatt. I have been with Pemberton Homes for 15 years, and I have been working in the residential management business for about 22 years. That's me in a nutshell.
Thanks very much. Allan, did you want to say a few words about yourself as well?
Sure. My name is Allan Wasel. I'm the Vice President of Operations at Hollyburn Properties. If you're unfamiliar with Hollyburn, it's a Canadian-owned company with about 5,700 units across Canada in 4 major cities, Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and Ottawa. Company has grown over since 1972, over 90 buildings. And most recently, we've added 2 purpose-built buildings to our portfolio. Bridgewater, which is just west of City Hall in North Vancouver, and the Lonsdale, which is on the corner of 13th and Lonsdale, not pitching it as a sales one, but just opened the other day. So we're very proud of it. It's a beautiful purpose-built rental, and you should drive by and take a look. I'll leave it for that. I think the sales pitch was plenty.
And I'm Hunter Boucher with LandlordBC, Director of Operations here. I've been with LandlordBC for over 11 years and work with our legislative helpline, present webinars. Some of you may have attended some of our webinars in the past. I see some familiar names of people who've joined us today, so that's great. Yeah, that's myself.
Perfect. So for just quickly, Hunter, if you can just give a little bit of information to the people who are logged in about where they can submit their questions to be answered.
Certainly. So there are 2 ways you can communicate with us. There is a webinar chat. There's also a Q&A as well. So if you want to put your Q&A into the Q&A tool itself, that would be great. And I hear that I'm a little quiet, so I'll move a little bit closer. Hopefully that's better. Yeah, so there's 2 ways you can communicate. Like I said, there is a chat function, but there's also a Q&A. And when we get to the Q&A session, Kimberly, who will be moderating this, will be able to look in the Q&A. And if we can keep the questions specifically to the Q&A section, that will really help us ensure that we can get to all your questions throughout this webinar instead of having to go back and forth to 2 sources. Also, just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for you to review later on as well, or share with your friends and fellow landlords.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's get started. I just wanted to kind of present the idea. So whenever everything launched with COVID, our society and everybody had to adjust really quickly, whether it was people needing to start working from home or landlords all of a sudden needing to start communicating more with their tenants about different options that they can take advantage of. And I'm just wondering, Allan, I'll pose this to you. Hollyburn is very good at engaging with their tenants. You guys do a lot of great social events and things like that to really build communities within your buildings. And I'm just wondering, at a very grassroots level, what do you find to be the most effective way of communicating with tenants?
Well, it's twofold for us. I mean, we have a very talented marketing team. I mean, not every member that's going to be on this call is going to have the same amount of staff that we have. But, you know, we send out weekly emails to everybody. We have the full list of all the residents across the portfolio. But during this pandemic, it's been a lot of posters, elevator boards, posters in laundry rooms, just identifying exactly what we're asking to do and all the changes that we're implementing daily. So they've been fantastic. They created a COVID email address. So if there are any specific questions, you can send it in. And like I say, we have some very talented people upstairs that respond immediately to everybody's questions. So I think it's response time, and I think it's just continuing to update people.
Yeah,
progress.
And Claire, how do you find it with communicating with tenants across a variety of different types of housing? What has worked really well for you?
So we've done the same. We've done some of the similar things with our multi-unit buildings, but we do have a lot of single-family dwellings and single stratas. So we found that the most effective way was to talk to people on the phone. I just spoke to one of my managers just prior to this webinar and said, you know, how many hours do you think you spent on the phone, you know, especially at the onset? And he said about 40 was his ballpark. So he spent a lot of time talking to the people. Our relationships are a bit different because we have not only a single family dwelling, but we have an owner and a tenant who are both, you know, have a lot of the same concerns when it comes to making sure that the rent is being paid on so many different levels. So although we did do a lot of point form emails to get information out, and we did a lot of emails that we could send to our tenants on how to get the financial aid that they might need, updating them when things were going to start, like the rent supplement, But generally speaking, the concerns that people had, we encouraged them to phone in. All the managers provided their cell phone numbers, so they would have immediate access to their tenants if they needed it. And that's basically how we handled it.
Yeah. One of the questions that actually just came in online, Hunter, I think this is a really good one for you. So with some of the legislative changes that came out, obviously communicating certain things to your tenants regarding expectations needed to be done. One of the things that came up was being able to restrict access to units in order to encourage social distancing. So tenants are able to request that a landlord perhaps not enter their suite unless it's a very strictly defined emergency. So how do you address things like emergency repairs to units in this situation, in this environment?
Definitely, that is a really good question. And what it comes down to is, first of all, always assessing whether or not the issue is in fact an emergency or not. We have to look at what is actually occurring, how are the tenants affected, how is the unit affected, how is the building affected. So if there's, a flood, obviously, if water's, flowing from a burst pipe or something like that, you need to attend fairly quickly and in a quick process. So the first thing is always triaging the situation to determine whether or not this is an emergency. And then if it is an emergency, communicating with your tenant as to how you're going to resolve this issue. Tenants at this point have the ability to say no when it comes to landlords entering their rental unit. So you want to make sure that you're communicating why you're entering, explain the need for it, put that in writing, and also pick up the phone, having a conversation with someone to hear their concerns as well, and be able to explain, this is the work we're going to do, but also these are the steps we're going to take to ensure that we're safe and you are safe while we're doing this work, such as wearing masks, keeping a distance, that sort of thing. So it's really just twofold, going down to ensure that you triage the situation, and using technology to triage those situations is a great solution that has kind of come out of this. Asking the tenant to hop on Zoom like we're doing today, or even Facebook Messenger, FaceTime, any type of video call service, and have them actually show you what needs to be repaired, and then go in and, like I said, do that repair with their permission. If it is a significant emergency, you are still able to enter the unit even without the permission, but it needs to be a very significant emergency. The test for that is quite high. So it always comes down to trying to work with those tenants.
Absolutely. So again, with coming back to the legislative changes and things that came out to address the provincial state of emergency, as we know, there was a moratorium put on ending tenancies that included ending tenancies for unpaid rent. But fortunately, the provincial government was able to put some supports in place to help tenants, make ends meet if they did suffer from a loss of job or loss of income due to COVID. How did you guys go about communicating how to apply for the temporary rent subsidy? What worked best for you? Did you find that tenants were receptive to that type of information? Claire, did you want to go ahead with that one?
We did a really very step-by-step email blast to the tenants, and we did some screenshots to help them understand how to fill out the application. We expressed to them that if they needed a copy of their tenancy agreement, it'd be very easy to contact us, and we would assure that they got a copy of it. We always had our doors open here. We never shut our office down the entire time. We had limited hours so that even if for whatever reason, maybe the property manager didn't have access, we did have a paper copy on file that we could get out to them. And we did do Zoom meetings with some people to help walk them through, or FaceTime, or actually it wasn't Zoom, it was mostly FaceTime, to walk them through how to apply for various things, whether it was the CERB or whether or not it was a rent supplement. So we tried to be as available as possible, and we also were available in ways that we wouldn't normally have been, whether it was like spending 15-20 minutes walking somebody through that process. We made sure we were there. So that's how we dealt with it.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways from all three of you is saying, pick up the phone, No, there's no such thing as too much communication, especially if there's a situation where somebody may not be as tech savvy, or you're dealing with an older individual who might not be comfortable navigating things online, that having that phone conversation is a really great way to continue that communication and build that rapport, so that the tenants are comfortable coming to you and saying, I'm in this situation and I'm going to need a little bit of help through these months. Allan, for you, with ongoing building maintenance and things like that in a multi-unit residential building, how have you found the tenants? Are they being receptive to the changes? Even for you guys with common spaces, having to close things like gyms, and I know some of the Hollyburn buildings in Vancouver have pools. How are tenants responding to that, and how did you communicate the necessity of those types of things?
Well, everyone's been very receptive. I mean, we put in very strict protocols with all our trades, screening them. They had to fill out documents. We have the luxury, obviously, of an occupational health and safety specialist who worked with every trade coming into the building. So we had that extra reassurance. If people were inquiring, who are these people coming into our building? Who are these people doing the work? We already had the answers in advance. So that worked out very well. As far as pools and gyms, we were working on it this morning. You drive over the Granville Bridge, you now notice that some of the gyms are opening. So we're just starting now to put some protocols into place in how to open them safely. It's obviously a little bit more challenging when you're dealing with residents, because you got to make sure that the gym is cleaned after it's used. So we're obviously going to look at time slots and whatnot. And with pools, we're trying to follow the lead of some of the municipalities and what they're going to do. And they haven't necessarily given their opening plan strategics out yet. So what we're planning on doing is we're probably going to wait till next weekend, and hopefully with the weather being better, we'll have a staggered sort of system where people can go into the pools. But most people are understanding it. And we always do, as Hunter mentioned, we triage everybody that comes into the building, whether it's potential renter or potential trade, and make sure that if the answers are not correct, unfortunately, they don't enter the building.
Yeah. And I think most people, especially at the onset when things were more strict, did understand the necessity for it. And I mean, you can see the results of the hard work that the province of British Columbia has done. We're killing it at getting rid of COVID and making sure we're keeping people as healthy and safe as possible. And I think everybody accepts that it was a joint effort on behalf of the entire province. One question here, Hunter, that's come up, and I know that there's going to be a lot of questions pertaining to legislation. And I just want to say at the outset that any new information we receive from the government regarding changes that are going to impact your business, we will share that with you via our e-news. We've been working to keep our members and the broader sector up to date on everything we know as it comes out. And as of right now, there's no further update to the state of emergency. We're still in it. The ministerial order is still in place. And if we hear otherwise, we'll be sure to communicate that with you. I want to be sure that we do mention, though, that with the ministerial order, yes, there is a moratorium on evictions. However, there is situations where ending a tenancy can be done. It's very specific, and there's a very strict criteria and a high standard that applies to that. But Hunter, maybe you want to speak about those emergency situations where tenancies need to be ended due to, a threat or damage to the property.
Certainly. So I just want to make sure that I'm loud enough for people to hear. I think I'm holding the mic up a little bit better now. So when it comes to emergency orders, they're not actually a new thing that's specific to COVID-19 and the province's response to that regarding tenancies. It's an established process through the Residential Tenancy Branch. And what it says in the Residential Tenancy Act is that the tenant is doing a specific thing, such as damaging the property or affecting the quiet enjoyment of another tenant or occupant of the residential property or the landlord, in such a way that it would be unfair to wait for a normal end of tenancy process to come into play, such as a 1-month notice, which is the standard notice when dealing with those types of issues. So it doesn't define what unfair is. We have to use our judgment on that. And the judgment generally is that it's a significant issue, such as a tenant has potentially physically attacked another tenant, and this unfortunately does happen. It's not a common occurrence by any means. I think most landlords would agree that this is not something that comes up on a regular basis, but it can happen. And when it does happen, the RTV has that solution in place. The process itself is done through dispute resolution, so you do not need to serve notice, such as a 1-month notice, as you normally would. You skip that step and you apply directly through the residential tenancy branch for a hearing. And the hearing generally is scheduled fairly quickly. For emergency situations, they try to get that done in about a week and a half, which for emergency situations sometimes seems like an eternity, but when it comes to normal dispute resolution processes is quite quick. Normal hearing can be anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks for an order of possession. So it is quite a bit quicker than the standard process. And as I mentioned, the test for this is high. You need to make sure you have your evidence in place up front. But it is a tool that can be utilized. And unfortunately, we have seen it utilized a few times throughout this pandemic to ensure the safety of other occupants.
There's a question here I'm just going to read straight from the portal. It's one that came in, and it actually has to do with 2 tenants and a disagreement between the 2 of them. And one thing that we've seen a lot at LandlordBC, landlords contacting us and tenants contacting us, is neighbor disputes between 2 people who, maybe they've never interacted before, but because we're all required to stay at home, noise complaints, disruptions to quiet enjoyment, those types of things which may not have been an issue before are starting to come out a little bit more as people are, living in these buildings, living in these units and not able to go out. So the question is, I have a 2-suite home. One tenant is highly unsanitary and won't allow access for pest services. Also, it's no smoking is allowed in the unit. But during COVID-19, the tenant is smoking inside and the smoke is upsetting the upstairs tenant. Communication isn't helping. Thoughts? So Allan and Claire, maybe we can start and see, in situations where 2 tenants are having a dispute and you've tried to go in and communicate with them and it's not working, what next steps do you take? Allan, in your situation, it would be in a multi-unit building. What do you suggest? Oh, I think Allan's frozen. So Claire, we'll go to you.
That's a really tough one. I mean, that comes up a lot, and there's no specific roadmap for dealing with those types of situations. Generally speaking, we try and get to the bottom of the issue with each of the tenants and why they're behaving in a certain way. The smoking in the unit, we'd have to send a cautionary notice over that, obviously, just to keep that on file. I mean, I would almost wonder whether or not that could be, damaging the landlord's property, because smoke inside a property can damage the property. So I think that I might consider that as well. But generally speaking, I mean, we've had several of those situations throughout this.
Sorry, I don't know if you're still speaking. I apologize. I'm having some technical problems.
No problem. Can you hear me, Allan? You're good? So yeah, I think that the best thing to do is to try and talk to those people. The unsanitary and not being able to get pest control in there is a concern. I think at that point that I might almost post to go into the property. I think it becomes an emergency if it's going to actually be it's a health and safety risk to the other tenants. So I would probably say that would classify as an emergency myself, and I would get a pest control person in there. So that's kind of where I would stand with that.
Yeah, and for us, we haven't had a whole lot of problems. We've been very transparent, and as Claire mentioned earlier, we've been on the phone, for hours every day working with everybody. So if there is a problem, we're trying to be as proactive as possible. We're walking everybody through it. And for the most part, people do seem to appreciate that personal touch. We're being very patient with people, more so than probably ever before, but it's a learning curve for us as well. But we haven't had any problems. We've really promoted in our buildings, we have a campaign going, won't you be my neighbor? So we're really trying to get everybody on the same page. And you know what, they have to live together. And when people aren't going out, obviously there's going to be some animosity and some noise. So I think we've walked everybody through the problem for the most part. But going forward, depends on how long this is going to last. Time will only tell if the approach.
And I think as things slowly start to reopen and people have a bit more freedom to get out and about, take their kids to playgrounds so that the kids aren't being as rambunctious and maybe causing disturbances to neighbors below because they just don't have anywhere to burn off that energy, that type of thing, we are going to see less and less of those neighbor spat type of things happening. One question that came up, Hunter, I think you would be a good one to answer this, is in terms of dealing with tenants who are perhaps using language that is offensive in a few different ways or behaving in ways that are discriminatory or even racist towards other tenants. What type of recourse does a landlord have in order to help mitigate those types of situations where it's becoming very disruptive for people living in the building?
Yeah, that's a significant issue, and unfortunately one that we're seeing happen in a somewhat more regular basis. It is something that can be addressed through the Residential Tenancy Act. But it's also something that's covered by the Human Rights Code. So there are two things to consider when dealing with a tenant who is perhaps being verbally abusive to another tenant or occupant of the residential property. The first thing we have to look at is, where does this fall in? How severe is the situation? Is this just a misunderstanding, or is it something that can be worked out amongst tenants, or do you need to take a stronger approach to your intervention? So again, it's like every situation, especially during COVID-19, you really need to start by interrogating the situation to determine what is really happening and how severe is this. If you do have a tenant who is verbally attacking another tenant, making racist remarks, there is a requirement. There is a requirement under the Human Rights Code that landlords take action to put a stop to discriminatory behavior, such as making racist remarks to other occupants. So that requirement exists. You have a duty to protect that other tenant in some way and take action. So that how that duty is translated to residential tenancies is either giving a caution notice and potentially giving a 1-month notice to end tenancy, which is what you would do in a normal situation without the pandemic that we're currently in. During COVID-19, we have to look at the emergency order option for those cases. And that definitely does meet that criteria in many cases. I can't say every situation, and to be clear, when it comes to applying for those emergency orders, the test is high for that. You need to ensure that it is significant enough that an arbitrator is going to agree that that tenancy needs to come to an end. But racist remarks certainly are something that would fall under that criteria very, very clearly.
Good to know. I have another question here that pertains to a strata rental. Claire, is this one that you would be able to help us with? So what it says is that the townhouse strata has decided to proceed with maintenance repair work for balcony post as planned starting in June. Yet the state of emergency is still valid and the tenant has refused to let the worker get in to do the work. So if such maintenance work is not carried out now, then who will bear the responsibility if damage happens down the road due to the lack of repair being done? What can the landlord do in this situation in order to ensure that these repairs are being completed as the strata has planned out?
That is a really tough one as well. I think there's a couple different ways of going about this. The first thing is to see whether or not the tenants can be put somewhere while the repair work goes on. So can they be put in, say, a hotel or an Airbnb or something like that, and that their particular unit can be the first unit to be completed, depending on how phased out it is. The second, I'm sure that the landlord has talked to the tenants about what is their actual concern and why are they refusing? Is it something to do with, is there a health concern at the property? Is there somebody who is more vulnerable to the COVID-19 than somebody else? Or then, that they're feeling this way? And then the other thing to do would be that the owner of the property would bear the cost of that for sure. So if they have to go back in and later on down the road. The order is very, very clear. So if the tenants do not want to allow them access and it wouldn't be considered emergency, the landlord would still be responsible for that cost and that repair down the road. So that's an unfortunate situation. I would go to the tenants and ask them, is there a possibility of us putting you in a hotel for 2 nights while this repair work gets done? Because I suspect that getting the repair work done with the whole project is going to be a lot more cost effective and worth a 2-night stay rather than having to get the repair work done at a later date by an independent coming back into the property. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. Just get more information and be sure that you know the full story, right? Because sometimes it can seem like people are just being difficult, but we really don't know what the underlying factors are on why this problem is happening.
And I would also, sorry, just to jump in there for one sec, Kimberly, I would also ask the people who are doing the repair work at the strata, do they have a plan? Like, what is their actual mandate for going into people's units? Like, are they wearing, do they have suits? Are they wearing booties? Are they wearing gloves? Are they wearing masks? Like, there's a lot of questions they could ask in advance to maybe help ease that tenant's mind instead of them just giving us, like, I don't know the details, but that would be kind of a starting point as well.
Absolutely. And I think the whole COVID situation has been very anxiety inducing for a lot of people, right? Yes. So we have to be sensitive to that and just realize that, the more information we can give to our tenants about, how we're going to go through doing repairs and stuff really provides that sense of security and eases a lot of anxieties that people have surrounding this. So one of the issues that's been an ongoing concern for landlords and tenants alike is their ability to pay and the ability to collect rent. As I mentioned earlier on, BC Housing is administering a subsidy. The provincial government rolled it out. BC Housing is in charge of administering the program. So one of the questions is, how are you addressing situations where the tenant has applied for the rent subsidy, which we know is $300 for individuals and up to $500 for families, and they're paying that towards their rent or partial rent, but the rent is still short. So how are you going about communicating with tenants regarding outstanding rent that they may have? Allan, did you want to start?
Sure. I mean, we've got 7 property managers and the portfolio is broken down. So we've done one-on-ones basically with every resident that will return our calls just to figure out what the best approach is. We put some people on payment plans just to accommodate their needs, and we're working with everybody. The money's come in very quickly, so that's been very good. But for the most part, we haven't had a collections problem. I think it comes down to screening too as well, so I thought I'd throw that in. But I think in the long run, if this continues, we're probably going to see more problems with arrears, and that's one of the concerns. But I think it's just being open and honest with the residents themselves, finding out what their issues are. We had a questionnaire that we had sent out early in the game, way back in March, just to track down, did they lose their job? What is their reason? What is their rationale? How do we think we can get a payment plan going? So, just being detailed and working with people, they've been very accommodating for the most part.
Claire, are you having a similar experience?
Yeah, we've done a bunch. It really has depended on the property, the tenant, and the landlord in many cases about sort of what lengths we're going to. Most of the time, the tenants have been very communicative, and they have, if they're deferring, we've got deferral plans in place. They've been talking to us. We've talked to our landlords. Landlords have suggested different things. And if we haven't heard from a tenant at all, we have gone to the property and knocked on the door and said, we haven't heard from you. If you can't pay rent, we understand that. We just want to make sure you're okay. We just want to make sure that you're not in a position where you don't have, groceries in the fridge or something really dramatic has happened. So we have definitely gone and knocked on doors as well, if we're not getting any traction on email or text or via phone. So we've done that. And that's, some people are sort of, there's been mixed emotions on that. But for the most part, people have been relieved to say, like, we're not angry. We just want to make sure you're okay. And let's figure out what we're going to do on the other side of this.
Absolutely. And I think that's the big thing, is just to keep that communication open. Even if you're dealing with situations where the tenant may not be responsive to the communication, it's just important to always be checking in and making sure that, you know, people are doing all right. Hunter, would you like to speak about some of the resources in terms of COVID and rent deferral agreements that LandlordBC produced for people to take advantage of? And just for a note, these resources aren't just available to LandlordBC members. Non-members and other people working in the sector can also access them.
Yeah, so when things started to ramp up around the kind of emergence of COVID-19 in British Columbia, and the province started taking quite significant action on this and implementing a variety of protocols for not just residential tenancy, but people in general to adhere to, we began developing quite a robust series of resources for landlords and property managers and rental housing suppliers of all types to utilize. And one of the first things that we generated was a payment deferral agreement. And the payment deferral agreement is essentially something that allows both a landlord and a tenant to come to a mutual agreement as to how rent will be paid if it cannot be paid in full on any given month. Obviously, we know that with the ministerial order that is in place, there is a moratorium on evictions, so there's no evictions allowed under unpaid rent situations. Obviously, we've talked about those emergency situations already, but the rent is still due. Just because you can't end a tenancy doesn't mean that the rent is not due. So this allows landlords and tenants to be collaborative as to how that payments are going to occur. And we found from our members, we've heard from our members and from non-members as well, because we've made these resources available to all landlords across the province. We've communicated it through our website, through our regular e-news, and through non-member e-news as well. So we're sending this information to everyone. That's probably one of the most significant things that has come out of this in terms of resources that we've developed. But we've also developed Q&A sections on our website and documents to help landlords and tenants both understand this, letter templates for landlords to send to their tenants to show that they care and explain the situation and explain some of the options that tenants have when it comes to applying for certain types of funding. So there is there's a really robust variety of resources that we've developed on this. And again, like I said, they're all available on our website, and we've been emailing them as they've been being developed to both, not just to our members, but to all landlords, because this is this affects all landlords regardless of membership or not, though.
So there's a question here that I wanted to address. It's a follow-up to the need to gain emergency access to a tenanted property. So the question is a follow-up question regarding the use of emergency and needing access to a tenanted property, like the example that Claire responded to about letting in pest control. So in such a situation, what steps should a landlord do? They still need to serve the written notice for access, or can the landlord just open the door to the tenanted property and let the pest control worker in? So what's the best steps for the landlord to take in order to be sure that they're respecting the tenant's rights in terms of their home, but also that the landlord is able to get those workers in to do the work? Claire, would you like to answer?
Yeah, I would definitely give them the proper notice, either contacting them and also posting on the door to let them know that this is what you're planning on doing, is bringing people into the property. And then I would also follow that up with information surrounding what the pest control person is going to be, what steps they've taken to ensure that, you know, they've got gloves and proper attire to make sure that they're not spreading anything into the unit. And then also I would have them fill out a disclaimer as well, which they probably are already doing, which basically states like they haven't been anywhere, they're not feeling sick, et cetera, and sign on that before the pest control entered the property. But I would definitely give the tenant a heads up. I wouldn't just go in there.
And I think that disclaimer is actually a really good suggestion. And I don't see landlords getting any pushback from service providers. I've dropped my son off at daycare and I have to fill one out every single time. I had to fill one out yesterday when I went to an appointment. So it is going to be standard practice for going to a lot of things. So it's definitely something worth implementing. A question here I just want to address is there still a moratorium on issuing rent increases? The answer to that is yes. The moratorium on that is still in place as long as the state of emergency is in place. Hunter, do you want to give a quick overview as to just a refresher to people who are listening in about what it means right now being in a state of emergency in terms of managing their tenancies? Just remind what they can and cannot do.
Certainly. So when the province first issued a state of emergency, it was just kind of across the board. There wasn't necessarily a lot of information specific to individual industries, but they did start creating ministerial orders. And these were orders that affected specific industries. And of course, there was one for us, understandably. And this ministerial order essentially amends the Residential Tenancy Act temporarily, while either the ministerial order is active, so they can choose to turn it off if they choose to, or the state of emergency. So it's generally tied to the state of emergency. So during this time, the key things to be aware of, we've talked about end of tenancies. They're not something that are currently allowed when it comes to our normal end of tenancies. The next one is about serving documents. So you cannot serve documents in person directly. So that has actually been something that has been disallowed during this. And to follow up on that, there has been an order from the director of the residential tenancy branch to allow email during this time, and some rules around that. So those are two big things that have come out of this. But additionally, there has been a stop to rent increases. And to be clear, the stop on rent increases is specifically the effectiveness of a rent increase. So while this ministerial order is in place, any rent increase that was set to become effective, I believe the date was March 29th of this year, so really April 1st, or throughout the remainder of the state of emergency, is not considered effective. So whenever you serve that rent increase, there's always 3 months notice that you give, and that effective date is that last day of the 3 months notice, or the first day of the next month, really. That is not effective until, again, the earliest at the end of the fixed term. So right now, we're urging landlords to not serve rent increases as of right now. So definitely avoid doing that. It's already an uncertain time as it is. So this is something that is affected by this. Again, we want to urge landlords to not serve rent increases at this time. One other thing that's been affected is, of course, landlords or tenants' right to say no to landlords entering the unit. So you have to obtain consent. And then the last one is landlords having the right to temporarily close certain common area facilities that potentially pose a risk to tenants if not cleaned properly, which cleaning properly during this time is a significant challenge.
That's actually a great lead into another question. Really quickly, though, I just want to mention, somebody says, is such a disclaimer regarding COVID available on the LandlordBC site? It's not, but that's a really good suggestion. So I'll look into how we can get a standard kind of COVID disclaimer form available to people.
I've got one, Kimberly, that I can send to you. So
yeah, that would be fantastic. There you go. See, these types of suggestions, we love to hear them. What we want to know what you need to best communicate and manage your businesses. So please don't hesitate to send us an email or reach out about that type of thing. One of the questions, I'm just looking for it here, as you were mentioning with common properties. So a question that came in is, what do you do when families are no longer practicing social distancing from other families and they're having people congregating in common areas? How can you, as the landlord, building owner, property manager, kind of politely remind people that that's not something that they want to be doing? Allan, if you want to go ahead with that one, because I know Hollyburn has some really great common spaces. So
for most part, our common areas have been shut down. So the meeting rooms, the gyms, the pools, but we've been putting protocols in, and we've notified everybody in the building not to have guests and whatnot. So most people, like I say, have been quite receptive to that. You know, as you drive through the West End now, you can start to see a few more people congregating on the lawns in front of buildings and whatnot. It hasn't been an issue, but I think what we would do is we would start off with our resident managers explaining them the significance of what they're doing. Then a property manager would probably step in, and then we would probably have to have a sit down, in this case, a phone call with them, and let them know that if this continues, it's going to be problematic, and we'll have to obviously take it to the next level.
Mm-hmm. And that also works in, there's a question of follow-up that says, is there still an expectation for only one family per elevator ride? And I think, to be frank, that expectation is going to be in place for a while in our society. I mean, even just our office building, which LandlordBC in Vancouver hasn't returned to yet, there's a restriction on how many people they want using the elevator. And I don't see that changing in a very long time. That's not something that's necessarily tied to the state of emergency, but it's definitely going to be common practice across people using elevators and things like that. Hunter, do you agree?
I definitely agree. You know, to be very, very clear, we're seeing certain things open up across the province as we go into phase 2, and eventually even further into phase 3, which is actually not that far off based on what we've been told from the province. But that doesn't necessarily affect the ability of people to get this disease. That hasn't changed. So common sense measures such as limiting your exposure in tight spaces like an elevator are going to be in place until there's a vaccine. And we've been told that. That's been very clear from Dr. Bonnie Henry, who's provided those regular updates and guidance. So yeah, I don't see that changing anytime soon.
And one other thing to note, and it's a marketing thing, a lot of the lower units, the lower floors, have rented a lot quicker these days because a lot more people are looking to take the stairs. So, you know, it's a change from the penthouse being the best to all of a sudden, I like one flight, I can go down the stairs in and out with 0 touch points.
Yep.
That's definitely a key point for sure.
Another question that's come up is people are asking about the state of emergency and whether or not it will be extended. Just to give a little bit of background for people who may not know, so state of emergencies are a very specific tool that government can utilize in situations like this, and they can be implemented for 14 days, and then they need to be extended as they expire. So the question a few people have asked is, has the state of emergency been extended? The answer is we haven't heard yet. My personal expectation is it will be, and we'll know that today.
And just another point to that, you know, the government has been fairly clear in their communications about providing expectations as to what we can see coming forward, such as outlining our plan to reopen the province to our economy and what that looks like. So I think it's safe to assume that this is not just going to expire and it'll be, oh, surprise, it's not in place anymore. I think that we'll likely have some type of advance warning from either Dr. Bonnie Henry or our premier, more likely, saying that it will expire at this point and we will allow it to expire.
One last question I think is really important that we touch on. We only have about 10 minutes left, so this may be the last one. We might have more depending, is the issue of serving notice. So serving notice is something that we could do an entire 1-hour webinar on. But in this specific situation, as Hunter mentioned, you can no longer serve notice in person. It's you know, they prefer that you don't. So the question is there any issue with posting notices on doors, especially for maintenance issues? No notices were being posted on doors previously, but is that still considered a method of service, so to speak? Hunter, do you think that's a good one for yourself?
Yeah, I can definitely. I mean, and I think we could probably all touch on.
Yeah, absolutely, please.
In terms of our individual approaches, it really depends. You know, posting things on the door, it has not been disallowed. You can still post things on the door. And there's certainly going to be situations where that makes sense. But there are other methods of service. So it really depends on what you're serving to the tenant. If you're serving something of significant importance, such as you have a dispute resolution hearing and you're supplying evidence, I would recommend registered mail for something like that. But if what you're posting is just a note that there's going to be people coming to the property to do some lawn maintenance, for example, or window washing, which they're doing on my building right now, you know, that's one of those things where I just got an email for that, and that was fine for me. I know that there were a couple notices posted on doors, and I know that those people in those units were people who I would assume don't have emails. But that's, you know, I think trying to look for those alternatives. And the reason that we want to look for those alternatives is, again, just limiting your exposure. If you're going to the property to post things on the door, especially in an apartment building, you're having to walk through all those halls, touch those surfaces, and that can be a problem. So yes, you can utilize it. It's fine to utilize it, but where possible, perhaps look for other options.
Another question that we have here, and again, it all comes back to just making sure you're communicating with your tenants, but with everybody sheltering at home and spending less time going out, I do want to address, it's another smoking pertaining to question, or excuse me, another question pertaining to smoking, is how can you stop a tenant from smoking? I understand most of that does need to be set out in the residential tenancy agreement. So if you entered into an agreement and you did not stipulate that they're not allowed to smoke, whether it's on the property or in the unit, what's the best way to communicate with somebody and let them know that, you know, either enforce a clause or let them know that you would prefer if they don't, and how you can maybe mitigate that? Who would like to take this one?
I'll take that one. I would just say, again, I think you need to be noticing the tenant and reminding them that you know, most tenancies are non-smoking, and there is a material term in their agreement, and they are in breach of the material term. And not, like, I think a gentle letter and a phone call at first, and then eventually a little bit more saying, you do realize, like, this could affect your tenancy once the state of emergency has lifted, and just having that conversation with them. It's one of those things where people are stressed, and if they're smokers, they might even be smoking more than they normally would, and they're in their property, and there's just like a whole gamut of things that you have to take into consideration. I've noticed so many people are on a different level of stress because everything is more difficult than it normally is. Like going to the grocery store is different, going to get your haircut is different. You know, everything is different. So people's level of what they're taking on is and how they're behaving is quite out of character in some cases. So I just really gently talk to them about it first, but you'd have to ramp it up if the behavior continued, and that would be my approach to it.
Yeah, and I agree 100% with Claire. I mean, you take a soft approach at the beginning, and you do reiterate that it's a material term of their contract, and this isn't going to go on forever. So it's at some point, it may result in the end of their tenancy. Not today, but potentially down the road. So,
and I think that's an important thing, that, you know, these problems, they are eventually going to have to be addressed. And so you do want to make sure you're maintaining that positive relationship and letting the tenants know, like, if you're going to be creating an ongoing issue for 6 months, 8 months, as things go on, it's no different, right? Like, we do have to have respect for the people we live with. There's one comment here I just want to touch on. It's a follow-up to what Hunter said with serving notice, mentioning that the RTV is allowing notice to be served via email. Yes, that was part of the ministerial order that came out during the state of emergency. One thing that actually Hunter and I were discussing this the other day is when you're serving documents, while email is an option, it may not be the best option. And the reason for that is because you need to have proof that that made it there. And if you send somebody a dispute package via email, you have no verification that they received that unless they respond to you, but you don't know. Things end up in junk mail. There's incorrect email addresses. So while it's an option, it may not be the best option for you, which is why Hunter did mention the registered post, because that way you have a receipt, it's deemed served, and it really backs you up in terms of how you're managing your business. Hunter, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just to kind of take that a little bit further too, when it comes to using email, you know, what it comes down to is you don't necessarily always need to receive a response back from the person receiving it, though that is obviously ideal, having that response back, acknowledging it. But obviously, if you're in a dispute with someone, the chances of them getting back to you saying, yeah, got it, it's about as likely. Yeah, exactly. Claire knows. I'm sure any landlord knows. It's no different than asking them to sign the proof of service when you serve something in person, which obviously, like as mentioned, don't do right now.
Yeah.
The other part to email is if you haven't been communicating with your tenant via email already and you don't have that back and forth, all of a sudden switching to email service is perhaps not advisable. In fact, it's not advisable at all. You want to have that communication with them. So at the very least, send, before you start communicating with email and relying on it, send an email back and forth saying, I just want to, confirm that we can use this email for communication. Obviously, if you're already in a dispute, it's a little too late for that. But there are other options. So, email is becoming more widely used, but there's going to be some complications with that and a certain amount of duty of care that comes with that.
Okay.
Hunter,
I would say, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
He's going to tell, hopefully Claire's going to say, just follow up with registered mail 100%.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah. One other question here, which I think is important, because again, the topic of this webinar is communicating with tenants specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the question is restricting guests. Is it not part of the Residential Tenancy Act that landlords cannot restrict guests? Now, this question, as it pertains to COVID-19 specifically in the ministerial order, Hunter, did you want to comment on the change there?
Yeah, there's always confusion about restricting guests. It does not say in the ministerial order that you can restrict guests. It says you can restrict guests to certain common areas, much like you can restrict tenants to certain common areas. And that's reasonable given the context. But under the Residential Tenancy Act, you cannot restrict guests to a tenant's unit. Now, there's something to take further that, though, is that there's obviously a potential risk when a tenant is having guests over. And if you have one tenant who has guests every night, or they're having parties on a regular basis, they have, a family barbecue with 30 people. We've heard about that recently. That's one of those things where you might not be able to address that through the Residential Tenancy Act, but bylaw officers and police officers are dealing with that as well. So if there's a risk to your building because someone is bringing people in all the time and they're just not adhering to the strongly worded rules about social distancing from our provincial health officer, then you can address it that way. And obviously, you start with some communication, as both Claire and Allan has said. You start with that soft approach. You try to communicate. You try to set those expectations, and then you go from there.
Absolutely.
I think too, I just want to follow up on that. We've had a couple of situations where people have had guests over at the property and it's bothered other people in the building, and we've reached out to them and said, this is really bothering your neighbors in a nice way. And in both cases, the tenants did not realize how sensitive their neighbors were to that, and they ceased the action immediately. They just said, well, I didn't know that it's my mother. In one case, it was a mother. In another case, it was a really good friend. And they just said, I didn't know this was like, they're sanitizing, they're doing everything. I said, yeah, I understand that. But the perception is that, they feel everybody's already anxious, and then having this additional person coming to your property is making them feel more anxious, and just need you to consider that. And then fortunately, both people were very understanding. So, again, instead of sending a nasty letter, we just reached out and said, hey, this is what we're hearing. So that's been the real takeaway from this entire situation, is that talking to people on the phone or contacting them has been really the best way to communicate.
Absolutely. I think it's been a big lesson for everybody on just, how to talk to people, how to communicate with people. And I think we've really learned how reasonable people are. Like, people are inherently want to help out and want to do things to support the community. And I think it's really important that we've seen that. One question that's come up a few times, and I just want to touch on it before we end, is talking about the temporary rent subsidy and confirmation on whether or not it's ending at the end of June. From what we know, the provincial government launched that subsidy and they administered that program with the goal of it lasting 3 months. So this would be the last month for it. We have no indication that it's going to be extended. As the province begins to reopen, the hope is, I would think, that people are slowly going to be starting to be able to return to work and things like that. And hopefully there will be a smooth transition to people being able to pay rent and their other bills that they had to kind of claw back on during this time, because it was just a very unprecedented situation. It all happened very quick. But no, we do not have any indication that the rent subsidy is going to be extended past the original 3 months that was presented when the program was first launched. Yeah, so is there any closing remarks that any of the panel would like to share? I want to thank everybody for participating. It's been fantastic that our members and panel participants have been so engaged with our webinar series, and it's really great to see landlords and people logging in to participate in these webinars. We can't get to every single question, and I apologize for that, but if there is anything that we didn't touch on, feel free to send us an email. If you're not yet a member with LandlordBC, I do really encourage you to explore that option, because that gives you access to our legislative helpline as well, where you can call in and speak with Hunter and his team, who are always available on the phone to answer any questions you have that are specific to your unit. That is a member's benefit. So if that's something you'd like to take advantage of as well, I do strongly encourage you to explore membership with LandlordBC. Before I forget as well, I also just want to be sure I once again thank our sponsor, TELUS. These webinars, they couldn't happen without sponsorship and engagement from corporations that are enrolled with LandlordBC to support our industry and support our members. So I do want to mention one more time that TELUS sponsored this webinar, so we're able to bring this fantastic information to you. So any quick closing remarks from anyone?
I just wanted to thank you, Kimberly, you, Hunter, and especially David. He's been fantastic during this, and it's been a great resource to go to, and it's fantastic to be able to align yourself with an association, because you don't want to be those one-offs that potentially come up with a great idea. So aligning with you guys and the information you guys have put out has been fantastic and very beneficial to our model and hopefully everybody else on this call. So a big thanks to you, and it was nice meeting you, Claire.
You too.
She was fantastic. We were along, our first phone call, we were all on the same page. So it's welcoming to have somebody with such knowledge of the industry right on the same page as you. So thank you. It was a pleasure meeting with you.
Thanks very much.
Alan. Thanks, guys. I just wanted to say one more thing in closing, is that there are so many different situations that come up. And as a property manager, both, I know Alan can attest to this as well, we've seen pretty much all of them. I mean, there are a few surprises, but occasionally, occasionally something is like, oh, that's a new one. But if you have a question or a situation that you're not sure about, reach out to Kimberly, and she can send that information to us, and we can see whether or not we've had something similar happen and help you out with that. Because it's a wild and woolly world out there right now, and we're here to help you, any of the members. And thanks, Kimberly and Hunter and Alan. And that's all I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much for participating. And I think that's it. We'll end it there. This webinar will be posted for people to review. I know a few people said that they had missed the start of it. That's not a problem. It's recorded. We'll get it posted up for you. And we'll also be sending out an email recap once everything's all said and done. So thank you, everybody, for attending. One more big thank you to our panels, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Perfect. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.